everyone. My name is Kailey O'Grady. My topic is the care of the elderly in a nursing home. I chose this topic because I felt that it was very relevant and very informative for this class. Introducing my topic of elderly abuse, unfortunately, elder abuse does happen and is also very common in nursing homes. People don't actually think that it's common in nursing homes because individuals are put in this facility for care. However, they sometimes are abused by their caregivers, which is very sad. For instance, individuals of ages 65 and older experience abuse from their caregivers, whether it be physical or emotional, but those are just two basic ones. Actually, while I was researching this topic of elder abuse, I found a study prepared by the minority staff of Special Investigation Division of the House of Government Reform Committee. They found that 30% of nursing homes in the United States, so that's about 5,283 facilities, were cited for almost 9,000 instances of abuse for over a 2-year period, which is horrific. They reported problems such as malnutrition, preventable accidents, inadequate medical care, simple ones, but still abuse. Why I care and chose this topic of elderly abuse comes from many different factors. I actually chose this background because I felt it was very relevant to the topic and that elder abuse does sometimes get swept under the rug. Individuals don't often think about elder abuse, however, I'm trying to change that by doing this presentation. I'm sure everyone knows someone or even has a family member in a nursing home. I would like to tell you guys about my personal experience of watching elderly abuse in the nursing home. My grandma is in a nursing home and she asked the nurse if she had taken her medication that morning because she didn't remember. And the nurse completely ignored her and made a rude remark under her breath and left the room. The neglect my grandmother felt was heartbreaking, and however, that was just only one of the incidents that I've seen. This is when I became very passionate about elderly abuse and stopping it. Now going into my thesis statement, elderly abuse is common and does happen even in their places of care. I feel like this is a strong thesis statement because of my personal experiences with my grandmother. I'm sure I'm not the only one that has seen this. If you have an elderly member or even a friend in a nursing home, I would strongly recommend going to see them and watching their surroundings because it does happen. Now going into the different kinds of abuse I will be talking about throughout this presentation, there are 4 different kinds. The first one is verbal abuse, which is how caregivers speak to the patients alone or around other people. The second is physical abuse, which is how the caregivers help them move around from place to place. The third is neglect, so reflecting back to my grandma on how she felt, as I stated previously, how caregivers ignore or treat them and their daily needs. The fourth is a little different. It's self-abuse. It's how these elderly individuals feel like they're not getting the treatment from their caregivers, so they try to do it themselves, which is just as abusive as any other abuse because they shouldn't be trying to do this themselves. That's why they're in this facility. Going into my first main point on verbal abuse, I felt that this picture reflected on the topic because the caregiver is clearly verbally abusing the patient. I would say that this type of abuse is definitely one of the more common ones and is one of the ones that I saw my grandma experience. Researching this abuse, I found that transitioning to a nursing home can be very tough on elderly people. These patients are usually emotionally vulnerable, and verbal abuse from their caregiver can be very harmful for their health. Verbal abuse is considered bullying. There are different kinds of verbal abuse. Some of them are yelling,
rude remarks like my grandmother got, speaking badly about patients to other staff members, which is also another common one. I did most of my research for this topic of verbal abuse off of Nursing Home Abuse Guide, which was very helpful. Going into my second main point, which is physical abuse. I picked this picture because this woman is clearly physically abusing the patient. However, I don't feel this abuse is as common as verbal. It still does happen. Abuse that causes harm done by violence to put the elderly patient in pain is what physical abuse is. There are also different kinds of abuse. For example, scratches, bites, bruises, even being pushed by her caregiver, or threats are all considered physical abuse. Researching this topic, the Assisted Living Federation of America cites that elderly abuse is a serious problem. The alpha of research shows that patients that are 300% increased risk of death during the 3 years following any event of elder abuse. In fact, alpha research also shows that roughly 1 in every 6 patients experience elder abuse actually report it. Walking around the nursing home, you could see all different kinds of abuse on the patients. These abusive caregivers are going to continue to do this abuse unless they are stopped. These victims need to start reporting this abuse or it will never end. This abuse has to be reported. I also did my research off our elderly abuse slides and the nursing home abuse guide. Going into my third main point, neglect. This type of abuse is more common, like verbal abuse. Neglect is failing to care for someone properly. There's also different kinds of neglect. There's passive neglect and there's active neglect. An example of active neglect would be what my grandmother experienced when she was intentionally ignored by her caregiver with no response. However, there is passive neglect, where the neglect is unintentional. Neglect is more than half of the reported cases on elderly abuse, so it's very common. Going into my fourth main point, which is self-abuse. This is another common type of abuse. This kind of abuse actually comes from neglect. Because the caregivers aren't doing their jobs correctly, this then makes the elderly try to do the caregiving on their own. They often end up only harming themselves, though. This tends to cause more harm and emotion than help. These elderly individuals are put in these homes for a reason. They need the support from their caregivers. They shouldn't have to try to do this themselves. Because their caregivers often aren't doing their job, the elderly population is then forced to try and do their daily needs themselves. This ends up only harming them and making it worse for themselves rather than helping them. Going into my last main point is actually questioning why some caregivers might do this harm. This is something I was continuously asking myself over and over again. Why would you be a registered caregiver and do the opposite of your job? This is something that I've always been confused about and goes into many different factors. Some of the factors might be that the caregiver might be overwhelmed with other responsibilities and doesn't even realize that they're neglecting the patient. It could be a substance abuse problem that the caregiver has, where he can't control his or her actions. They might have financial problems at home that no one knows about, so they do elder abuse at work to lash out and take their anger out when they shouldn't be doing that on the patient. However, there are many different factors. There's still zero excuse for elder abuse. In conclusion to my topic on elder abuse, all those different main points I explained earlier is what made me choose this topic. Verbal abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and self-abuse all mean different things, but are all different forms of abuse. and that does happen in nursing homes. Some caregivers, however, are doing this abuse intentionally, and some are doing it unintentionally. However, abuse is abuse whether it is intentional or not. This abuse has such an effect on the elderly population. They tend to think they deserve this treatment. They start to think it's normal that they are getting treated like this. They begin to feel helpless and stop fighting back. Reflecting back to my thesis statement, which is, elderly abuse does happen even in cases of care, I hope that I showed you it does. My goal was to make everyone more aware of this topic of elder abuse. Having a loved one like my grandma being abused by her caregiver had a large effect on me and my family. No one, especially the elderly population, should feel this way. These patients are put in this home for a reason. These elderly individuals deserve 100% from their caregivers at all times. Researching and learning more about this topic has shown me how serious it is. If you are a victim of elderly abuse or know somebody who is, start reporting it. If no one reports this stuff, it will never be stopped. They will continue to fight. I hope that after this presentation, you will want to stop the way I wanted to stop. These are all my different citations that I used for research and helping me support my thesis statement.